So one of the big problems that these theories have to deal with in their postmodern roots is that in order to critique the oppression of one group by another, say women by men, you have to have stable categories to speak about. I think this is, part of why we end up getting the conflict between, say, so-called TERFs and trans people, right? Because they see the trans people as kind of obliterating these categories that feminism, prior to kind of postmodern feminism, liberal feminism, radical feminism, have used to talk about oppression. And that also kind of, just as another side note, it also kind of explains that why the language has to keep changing constantly. Because the language that's designed to liberate, if categories are inherently oppressive, then the language that's designed to liberate will become oppressive pretty quickly, and constraining. So that's why you have to keep constantly changing the terms, kind of like to escape this oppressive quality of language and categories. So the different fields come up with kind of different ways to deal with this. The ability to be kind of activist and to get things done requires categories that you can speak about. It requires you to be able to speak with some degree of coherence or accessibility, at least for the core concepts, at least for what you're trying to defend. So there's a few examples of this. So you get this feminist LGBT writer, Judith Butler, who's really influential, I guess, in the late 80s, around 1990 or just before then. She comes up with this idea of gender performativity. So that means basically the categories we're talking about with gender, they're not really real. They don't refer to essential things in human nature, but they do exist as performances. Not that she means that people are sort of self-consciously performing, but that these performances are embedded and so deeply taught that people aren't even aware that from a very young age they're performing these categories. So this is where we get queer theory. So queer is used as a verb. To queer something is simply to destabilize these categories. And other than that, it has no meaning in itself. It's usually used to deconstruct categories of sexuality, gender, and sex, but it's not necessarily limited to that. So one writer in this field, David Halperin, defines queer as whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. He says there is nothing in particular to which it necessarily refers. It is an identity without an essence. So anything and everything can be and has been queered, including, as the authors note, time and space, life and death. But usually it's used for matters of sex, sexuality, and gender. But as you can see, that we're getting to the point where incoherence is a feature, not a bug. Incoherence is a one way to liberation if categories are oppressive, and it also makes your theories harder for other people to criticize, which is a nice bonus.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head with citing the word liberation, right? I mean, that's the goal. It's not clear what liberation is, but it certainly is a belief that to sort of be free, if you will, is to kind of be your own true self. What is that true self? It's not clear that there is such a thing. I mean, again, this is part of the kind of mythology, if you will, of postmodernism that's been taken on, that there is some kind of authentic self inside of you, and you can seek it out. You can try to react against norms, right? And certainly one sees in queer theory the strongest denunciation of norms of all kinds. And so attempts to deconstruct binaries so that increasingly, right, that a person is not, let's say a trans man is not a woman who believes him or herself to be a man and then takes on the characteristics of men, like wears male clothing, might take hormones to grow facial hair, etc., but doesn't have to take on any biological characteristics at all. And so to destabilize the very categories is the point, to destroy the very concepts of male and female, and to have all kinds of sexual identities that are neither male nor female. And this is why you get the rise of a whole plethora of pronouns, right? And so increasingly you will see trans persons going by they, or even quite obscure kinds of novel words that you don't hear quite as much, but I guess in certain circles they might use more often. And so there, I think in queer theory, one does see much more relationship to that kind of high deconstructive phase of postmodernism. I don't think it waned nearly as much in queer theory as it might have in some of the others. So this is something I talk about a bit in my book, From Tolerance to Equality, that there were a lot of queer activists in the 1990s and the 2000s who were very much opposed to same-sex marriage, because what they were opposed to was marriage itself. They were opposed to an institution that normalized sexual behavior and said, even if you will have a same-sex couple, there will still be marriage. And many liberals in America were very adamant to say, we're not destroying marriage. We're just tweaking it a tiny bit to bring in same-sex couples, but everything else is going to stay the same. And so in many ways, homosexuality became, this is my argument in the book, became normalized. That is, it just became a normal way of being by participating in lots of the institutions of society, and not just marriage, but the military. That was a big thing under Clinton, right? If one remembers all the way back then, right? Gays in the military, so-called. What the queer activists wanted were the destruction of all of these categories, the destruction of marriage itself. And at least in the gay rights movement, that was mostly not what kind of mainstream, if you will, gays and lesbians wanted. But the queer activists very much wanted that, and still continue to do so, want to destroy categories, not to have people shifting between categories. And I think that's what's so important to remember about all of these iterations of postmodernism, is that in their different ways, right? Because one of the postmodern I've forgotten the terminology here, but one of the postmodern themes, right, is cultural relativism, that there's nothing that is appropriate, true, normal, if you will, for all people. And so there really is this attack on universality. There are just different ways of being. And certainly we would all agree that at some level that's true, right? We don't all need to listen to the same kinds of music, or we all have to, enjoy the same kinds of foods or whatnot. But when it comes to certain kinds of moral principles that are rooted in claims about human nature and humanity, this is something that postmodernism attacks and says there's no such thing as humanity. There's no such thing as the human experience. And so therefore, we have to destroy all kinds, all manner of notions of normality or expectations. And therefore, supposedly, liberation is going to arise from the destruction of these things.